Beneath the coral sand of 100 forgotten islands, the wreckage of an air force larger than most nations ever built still lies buried, bulldozed, sunk, and left to rot on purpose. In the final months of 1945, the United States possessed the most powerful air fleet in human history, scattered across a chain of Pacific islands that stretched from Hawaii to the edge of Japan. And in less than 2 years, most of it was gone. Not destroyed in combat, not shipped home in triumph, simply erased, pushed into the sea, buried in pits, or left to dissolve under the jungle canopy. Today, divers still find propeller blades in lagoons where no battle was ever fought. Farmers in Papua New Guinea still plow around fuselages half swallowed by red earth, and almost no one alive remembers why it happened, or how fast. To understand the scale of what was abandoned, you have to understand what the Pacific had become by the summer of 1945. Across islands most Americans had never heard of before the war: Tinian, Kwajalein, Peleliu, Los Negros, Guadalcanal, Espiritu Santo. The United States military had built an infrastructure empire almost overnight. Airstrips carved out of jungle and coral in a matter of weeks, fuel depots holding millions of gallons, machine shops, hospitals, radar stations, and barracks capable of housing tens of thousands of men on islands that had held nothing but coconut palms a few years earlier. Tinian alone became, for a brief window, the busiest airfield on Earth, its runways launching B-29 superfortresses toward Japan around the clock. This was not a temporary camp. It was a civilization built for war, assembled with a speed and confidence that still seems almost unbelievable. And then, the war ended. And Washington had a problem no one had planned for. The equipment scattered across the Pacific was staggering in both scale and value. Thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of vehicles, mountains of spare parts, tools, generators, and munitions. On paper, this was an asset worth billions of dollars. In practice, it was a logistical nightmare that nobody wanted to pay to solve. Shipping a single aircraft engine back to the mainland cost more than the engine itself was now considered worth, because the war had ended the market for surplus military hardware overnight. The Army Air Forces did not need 3,000 fighters sitting on a coral airstrip in the middle of the ocean. Neither did anyone else. And the islands themselves, remote, often disease-ridden, with no permanent American population to justify long-term bases, offered no reason to keep the machinery running. So the military made a decision that, from a distance of 80 years, still feels almost violent in its finality. Rather than pay to bring the equipment home, they decided to destroy it in place. The process became known informally among the men who carried it out as the bulldozing. On islands across the Pacific, functioning aircraft, many with only a few dozen flight hours on them, were driven or towed to the edge of cliffs, into freshly dug pits, or straight into the lagoon, and pushed until they disappeared. Bulldozers, the very machines that had carved the runways into existence, were now used to erase them. Witnesses described watching brand-new fighters and bombers, planes that had never fired a shot in anger, rolled off coral bluffs into the Pacific like unwanted furniture. On some islands, entire rows of jeeps, trucks, and construction equipment were driven into pits and buried under bulldozed coral, their engines still capable of running. Fuel drums were punctured and burned. Radios and instruments were smashed with sledgehammers, not because destruction was required, but because it was faster than sorting what could be salvaged from what could not. The men ordered to do this work were, in many cases, deeply unsettled by it. These were mechanics and ground crews who had spent years keeping these machines alive, nursing engines through humidity and salt air, scavenging parts to keep aircraft flying one more mission. Now they were told to destroy the very things they had fought to preserve. Some accounts describe soldiers deliberately sabotaging the demolition orders, hiding tools, quietly diverting parts to local missionaries or islanders, or simply walking away rather than participate. Others followed orders numbly, describing a strange, hollow feeling, watching machines that had helped win a war get buried like garbage. It was, for many of them, the first time the true cost of victory came into focus. Not in blood, but in waste. The reasons behind the decision were never purely military. They were economic, political, and deeply bureaucratic. The United States was rapidly demobilizing, and Congress had little appetite for continued military spending on remote Pacific outposts. Import tariffs and trade protections back home meant that dumping cheap surplus equipment onto the domestic market risked undercutting American manufacturers who were retooling for peacetime production. There were also fears, however overstated, that surplus military technology could fall into the wrong hands if left unsecured on islands with limited oversight. And there was simple, grinding logistics. With limited ships, limited fuel, and limited manpower, moving everything home was never realistically possible. Destruction was, from the Pentagon's perspective, not a betrayal of the war effort. It was the cheapest, fastest way to close the books on a conflict that had already been won. But not everything was destroyed. And that is where the story takes its strangest turn. On some islands, aircraft were not bulldozed, but simply abandoned where they sat, left with fuel in their tanks and instruments still on their panels, as if the crews had only stepped away for a moment. Entire airstrips were walked away from wholesale, left to the jungle. Over the following decades, the tropical environment did what explosives and bulldozers had not needed to finish. Vines swallowed wings. Corrosion ate through aluminum skin. Engines seized under decades of rust. Local populations, left to inherit these strange steel ghosts, repurposed what they could. Corrugated fuselage panels became roofing. Engine housings became water tanks. Propeller blades became grave markers. The machinery of a global war became, quite literally, the building material of everyday village life. Perhaps no single discovery captures the eerie afterlife of these abandoned airfields better than the case of a B-17 bomber nicknamed the Swamp Ghost. In 1942, the aircraft had crash-landed in a remote swamp in Papua New Guinea after a failed bombing mission, its crew surviving a harrowing trek through the jungle to safety. The bomber itself, however, was left behind, sinking slowly into the marsh. For 30 years it sat untouched, invisible to the outside world, its aluminum skin darkening but its structure eerily intact, thanks to the swamp's oxygen-poor mud. It was not rediscovered until the early 1970s, when a rare aerial sighting revealed its shape still sitting in the shallow water, wings level, as if waiting. When recovery teams finally reached it decades later, they found personal effects, ammunition, and equipment almost exactly as the crew had left them. A frozen moment from a war that, for that patch of jungle, had never technically ended. Stories like this were not isolated. Across the Pacific, aircraft and equipment continued to surface for decades after the war's end. Some deliberately hidden, others simply forgotten because no one in Washington considered them worth the paperwork to reclaim. Kwajalein Atoll, once one of the most heavily fortified Japanese strongholds before its capture by American forces, became a dumping ground for equipment considered too costly to remove. Divers exploring its lagoon decades later found Sherman tanks, aircraft engines, and landing craft resting on the seafloor in eerie formation, an underwater museum nobody had intended to create. Eniwetok and Bikini, further north, faced an even stranger fate. Transformed from wartime air bases into nuclear testing grounds, their remaining infrastructure irradiated and off-limits for generations, turning abandoned military equipment into something closer to forbidden relics than historical curiosities. The human cost of this abandonment extended beyond the soldiers who carried it out. Island communities that had hosted American bases often found themselves suddenly stripped of infrastructure that had, however briefly, transformed their economies. Airstrips that had brought food, medicine, and contact with the outside world fell silent within months. Some islanders who had worked alongside American forces, learning skills in mechanics, construction, and logistics, found themselves with no equipment left to apply that knowledge to. The machinery that had trained them buried in pits a few hundred yards from their villages. In a strange, quiet way, the disposal of American war material became one of the first case studies in what happens when a global superpower simply leaves, not through defeat, not through negotiated withdrawal, but through the sheer economic logic of a war machine deciding it no longer needed what it had built. What makes this story darker still is how deliberately the decision to erase this equipment was buried in more ways than one. Official military records regarding the scope of destroyed material in the Pacific remain incomplete, scattered across dozens of unit histories rather than compiled into a single accounting. For decades, historians have had to rely on fragments, a photograph here, a veteran's oral history there, a diver's chance discovery, to reconstruct just how much was lost. Estimates of destroyed aircraft alone run into the thousands, though no single document confirms an exact figure, a silence that feels less like oversight and more like an institution quietly hoping the story would fade with the men who lived it. In an era when every dollar of wartime production had been celebrated on newsreels and posters, the sudden, silent disposal of that same production felt like something the government preferred not to advertise. The legacy of those decisions is still being uncovered today. Environmental researchers now study leaking fuel drums and unexploded ordnance buried on Pacific islands as active contamination hazards, decades-old poison seeping quietly into groundwater and reef systems. Wreck diving tourism has grown around sites like Chuk Lagoon and Kwajalein, where visitors descend into the blue water to see tanks, planes, and ships resting exactly where they were left. An accidental museum built from indifference rather than intention. Aviation archaeologists continue to search the jungles of Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands for aircraft that vanished from official records the moment their engines were shut off for the last time, machines that technically still belong to the United States government, but that no one has claimed in 80 years. What lingers, more than the machinery itself, is the strange emotional weight of the decision behind it. A nation that had asked its citizens to sacrifice everything for total victory, rationing, war bonds, factory shifts, sons sent overseas, turned around within months of that victory and buried the tools of that sacrifice in unmarked pits across the Pacific, not out of cruelty, but out of cold, practical arithmetic. It is a quieter kind of tragedy than combat, but a tragedy nonetheless. The realization that the machines built with such urgency, flown by men who trusted their lives to them, could be discarded with the same bureaucratic indifference as broken furniture, once the war that gave them purpose was over. Somewhere beneath the surface of a Pacific lagoon tonight, a propeller blade still catches the moonlight filtering through the water, resting exactly where a bulldozer pushed it more than 80 years ago. No monument marks it, no plaque explains it. It simply waits, the way so much of this story has waited, for someone to ask the question that so few ever thought to ask. What really happened to the machines that won the war, once the war no longer needed them? If this hidden chapter of history moved you, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more forgotten stories from the aftermath of the Second World War.